Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the situation in Zimbabwe from the World Health Organization. I'm joined by Dr. Claire-Lise Chanier. She heads the Global Task Force on Cholera Control. To get a political perspective, we're joined by George Shearer, a Zimbabwean analyst, and by U.S. Ambassador Anthony Holmes. Now, just before the break, we heard there from George Shearer, and Ambassador Holmes, you want to respond to some of the remarks that Mr. Shearer was making?
Well, I would just say that I agree. What we have here is two separate crises. There's an immediate humanitarian emergency related in the first instance to the cholera epidemic, but that itself is based on a true food emergency in which the majority of the Zimbabwean people are malnourished and hungry, and soon the vast majority will be dependent on international food assistance. But that itself is a result of the horrendous misgovernance of the country and the incredibly poor decisions and the corrupt decisions by Robert Mugabe and his government. And it is no accident that the country is in this situation. It's been on a long downward spiral for the entire decade, and we're not going to have any sort of enduring solution to the humanitarian crisis unless we have a viable solution to the political and economic crisis. That's what the compromises that the political opposition made in mid-September were all about. That's what most of the African countries would like to see. And yet here we are 3 months to the day after that compromise with virtually no progress in terms of implementing it. The reason there's been no progress is because the Zimbabwean government and President Mugabe have systematically backed away from all of the compromises and concessions they made to reach it in the first place. So we've gone full circle. People continue to die, people continue to starve, and how long is the international community, and in particular, how long are the African nations themselves, Zimbabwe's neighbors and partners in SADC and in the African Union, willing to continue to just peer over the border and observe these tragedies without actually deciding on action?
Okay, I want to get one of our callers in now. This is Christopher calling from the United Kingdom. Christopher, go ahead with your question.
Hello. Well, thank you very much. Just want to say, well, thank you very much for coming up with this program anyway. But, I mean, having looked, I'm actually Zimbabwean myself, and I live in London. Having looked into the situation in Zimbabwe, I feel very strongly that we are now going through a situation where actually governance in the world is actually becoming a gimmick. And a lot of people in different countries, not only referring to Zimbabwe as such, they're suffering as a result of all these imbecile leaders we have got everywhere, coming with empty promises. And to be very clear, as far as the Zimbabwean situation is concerned, if we had any people who are actually intelligent in the way of common sense, it is high time we stop condoning Mugabe or condoning Morgan Tsvangirai. What we need is a situation that brings that country back together by bringing and connecting all the Zimbabwean people to into one direction. Politics is actually being used. I mean, we're politicizing the economy, we are politicizing everything. And we've also got a situation where we've got bigger countries that are actually funding confusion in Africa, militarily, politically, we're meddling in all these affairs, whereby actually Mugabe speaks the same language as Tsvangirai, and I do not see why we would have to actually wait for the United Nations to make a decision on a situation which he can resolve tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that call, Christopher. George Shearer, Christopher from the United Kingdom there makes a good point. But the question is, you know, when you look at the situation in Zimbabwe right now, how did a country like Zimbabwe, which used to be called the breadbasket of Africa, which used to be a net exporter of food, now, in the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, become a basket case itself?
Well, Zimbabwe was a so-called breadbasket during the reign of ZANU-PF. I am old enough to have lived during the period of Indian Smith, and I happen to have lived during the period of 1964-65, when there was endemic famine and destitution of the kind that nobody is yet to describe. So the good old days that even people talk about happened during the 15 years of ZANU-PF rule. We have to ask ourselves, what is it that has happened in the last 10 years that has created this condition? And one cannot avoid the stubborn representation of the land question and the way in which it's brought Zimbabwe and a number of other international institutions into conflict. That's the first. No third world country can exist without balance of payment support. And Zimbabwe's inability to secure foreign currency in that sense has meant that its ability to maintain its own infrastructure has become limited. You need to compare 1993 cholera epidemic and now and ask yourself, why was the Zimbabwean government able to respond to the cholera outbreak in 1993 and unable to do so now? The question lies quite starkly in the absence of sufficient resources to deal with the scenario that they have at the moment. That's why everybody in the region keeps on talking about assisting the people of Zimbabwe as opposed to intervening.
Well, who do you blame for those lack of resources?
Well, the first thing I would want to say is if you look at the UN's own consolidated appeal, you have to ask what has been the response of the same people who are calling for intervention in Zimbabwe now. I think that the response is muted. The second thing, the more horrific story, the way in which the representation of Zimbabwe is done does not make people want to help Zimbabwe. It makes people want to hate Robert Mugabe. So it's a multifaceted people to blame. Some of it is to do with what I would call the politics of representation. Some of it is to do with some government, international institutions with a vested interest in the land question. And third, some people want to see a preferred outcome in Zimbabwe, which is a regime change. If we pull those three things together, they produce the crisis you have.
You know, there are, if you look at the land question that you did talk about, land was appropriated taken from white farmers, subdivided into smaller tracts, and given to landless peasants in those particular areas. Now, there are many who believe that the beginning of this current dire situation started when that happened, when that land was redistributed.
Anand, excuse me, let me interject here.
Okay, go ahead, and then we'll have Ambassador Holmes.
If you remove the so-called smart sanctions, which are not that smart after all, as has been asked by Southern African Development Community, has been asked by, and again reiterated in September 15 statement, Zimbabwe has a template that enables it to turn around its own economies within its own network, within its own framework, with the assistance of its neighbors. Let's call it bluff. Remove those sanctions and see what happens. If you remove those sanctions, Zimbabwe will begin to stand on its own feet.
Okay, George, thank you. Ambassador Holmes, you were saying?
Well, just briefly about the sanctions. The sanctions are the freezing of assets of 168 wealthy cronies of the president who have stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from Zimbabwe and the Zimbabwean people. There are no trade sanctions. There are no economic sanctions on the country itself. So blaming the crisis on the international sanctions is a complete canard. But more importantly, I think it's important to recognize that the evisceration of the agricultural sector of the Zimbabwean economy has been based on disruption of the land system, as Dr. Chire says. But in reality, what we've seen is not a division of the land that was seized and its dispersal to landless peasants. What we've seen is the wholesale transfer of white-owned farms to the black elite that continues to prop up President Mugabe. So the biggest landowners are Mrs. Mugabe, the heads of the military services, and the heads of the intelligence services, and none of those farms are being productively put into production. It's a well-known fact that I'm sure Mr. Chire can verify, is that even before the seizures began, the government had in its own possession 3.3 million acres of productive land through the Agricultural Development Corporation and other parastatals that it could have easily distributed to landless peasants if it were interested in a economic solution.
Ambassador Holmes, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt this conversation right now. We've run out of time. I'm sorry, George Chire, I'm sorry, we've run out of time. I'm sure we could go on talking about this, but time's caught up with us. Thank you all for being with us. And thank you for being with us. Don't forget to send us your questions and comments about pressing issues around the world. Our email is riz@aljazeera.net. That's all from me and the team. See you next time.